James had always wanted to give his kids the childhood he never had, full of adventure, imagination, and freedom. So when his two children, Emily and Jake, begged him to build a treehouse in their backyard, he didn't think twice. He spent weekends carefully designing and constructing the perfect hideaway, making sure it was safe, sturdy, and filled with cozy little touches like fairy lights and a secret pulley system. The moment it was finished, Emily and Jake's eyes lit up with excitement, and they ran up the ladder, declaring it their new clubhouse. James felt a surge of pride. He had built something special for his kids, something they would remember forever. But the joy didn't last long. Just a few days later, James found an official-looking letter taped to his front door. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. The message was clear. Your treehouse is in violation of HOA guidelines. Take it down immediately or face legal action. James frowned as he read it. He had lived in this neighborhood for years and had seen other families build similar structures. Why was his treehouse a problem? Frustrated, he decided to attend the next HOA meeting to get some answers. At the meeting, the HOA president, Mrs. Davenport, wasted no time in calling him out. "Mr. James, your treehouse is an eyesore. It doesn't fit with the community's aesthetics," she said, her tone dripping with disapproval. James clenched his fists. "It's just a treehouse for my kids," he argued. "Other people have backyard playsets. Why is mine an issue?" The room fell silent. Then, another board member smirked and said, "Because you didn't ask for permission." That's when it hit James. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. And he wasn't about to back down. James refused to take the letter as the final word. He went home, poured himself a cup of coffee, and spent hours combing through the HOA's rulebook. Nowhere did it explicitly say that treehouses were prohibited. It only mentioned that permanent structures required approval. But his treehouse wasn't permanent. It was built on a sturdy platform, sure, but it could be dismantled if needed. Feeling confident, he wrote a formal response, explaining that his treehouse didn't violate any stated rules, and that he had no intention of taking it down. He mailed it to the HOA, expecting a reasonable discussion. Instead, he received something far worse. A week later, another letter arrived, but this one was from a law firm. The HOA had escalated the situation, hiring a lawyer to force James into compliance. The letter claimed that James was disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood and would be fined $500. For every week the treehouse remained standing. James was furious. It wasn't just about the treehouse anymore. It was about standing up against a petty, power-hungry board that thought they could bully him. He wasn't about to let them win. Determined, he started talking to his neighbors. To his surprise, many of them had their own horror stories about the HOA. One couple had been fined for planting flowers that were too bright, while another family had to repaint their mailbox 3 times because it wasn't the right shade of brown. It was clear. This HOA thrived on controlling people with ridiculous rules. Seeing how fed up everyone was, James had an idea. If the HOA wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But he wasn't going to do it alone. James wasted no time rallying his neighbors. He created a group chat and invited everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted by the HOA. Within hours, the chat exploded with messages. People sharing their frustrations, their outrageous fines, and their growing resentment toward the board. It turned out that nearly everyone had been affected in some way. "This is ridiculous," one neighbor Tom wrote. "They fined me for leaving my garbage bin out 10 minutes past pickup time." Another neighbor, Sarah, chimed in. "They made us remove our garden gnome because it disrupted the uniform look. Who cares about a garden gnome?" The more people spoke up, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood. It was about controlling it. Realizing they had strength in numbers, James proposed a plan. "We need to push back. If they want to use legal threats, we can fight fire with fire. Let's get a lawyer too," he suggested. The group agreed, and within days, they pooled their money to hire a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Their lawyer, Mr. Carter, wasted no time drafting a response. He pointed out that the HOA's legal threats were baseless, since there was no actual rule against treehouses. He also demanded the HOA provide proof that similar structures had been banned in the past, something James knew they couldn't do. When the HOA received the letter, they didn't respond immediately. Instead, they called an emergency meeting, inviting only James. But James wasn't stupid. He wasn't walking into their trap alone. He showed up with Mr. Carter and half the neighborhood, all armed with their own complaints. Mrs. Davenport's face turned pale as the residents filled the meeting room, their voices rising with frustration. The HOA had always counted on people being too afraid to fight back. But now, they were facing a full-scale rebellion, and James wasn't about to let them get away with their abuse of power any longer. The room buzzed with tension as James and his neighbors took their seats. Mrs. Davenport adjusted her glasses, clearly flustered by the unexpected turnout. "This meeting was meant for Mr. James alone," she said, trying to regain control. But James wasn't having it. "No. This meeting is for everyone who has been unfairly targeted by this HOA," he shot back. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't going to be as easy as they had hoped. Mr. Carter, the lawyer James had hired, leaned forward and placed a thick folder on the table. "We've reviewed the HOA's guidelines thoroughly," he said. "There is no rule that prohibits treehouses, nor any rule that justifies the fines you've been issuing. In fact, we have multiple residents here who have been fined for equally absurd reasons. That's called selective enforcement, and it's illegal." The room went silent. Mrs. Davenport's face twitched. She hadn't expected anyone to challenge their authority with actual legal backing. One of the other board members, a grumpy-looking man named Mr. Whitmore, scoffed. "We have the right to maintain community standards," he said. "If we allowed everyone to build whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would look chaotic." James folded his arms. "So where was this standard when my neighbor built a playset last year? Or when the Johnsons installed that fountain in their front yard?" The crowd murmured again, nodding in agreement. The HOA had been picking and choosing who to go after, and now they were being called out in front of everyone. Mrs. Davenport opened her mouth to respond, but she had no real defense. For the first time, James felt the power shift in his favor. Mrs. Davenport's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents in front of her, searching for anything that could justify their actions. But it was clear. The HOA had no real case against James or his treehouse. The room remained silent for a long moment until she finally cleared her throat. "Regardless of technicalities, the HOA board has the authority to determine what is and isn't acceptable for our community," she said, attempting to sound firm. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Tom, James's neighbor, stepped forward. "You mean you have the authority to harass us with unfair fines and rules that only apply when it suits you?" he snapped. Others nodded in agreement. The board was losing control, and they knew it. Mr. Carter leaned in, his voice calm but sharp. "Actually, no. You don't have unchecked authority. Homeowners have rights. If you continue targeting residents unfairly, we have grounds for a lawsuit." The word lawsuit sent a ripple of shock through the room. A few board members whispered amongst themselves, looking uneasy. James could see the fear in their eyes. They weren't used to being challenged like this. "And just so you're aware," Mr. Carter continued, "we've already started gathering signatures from homeowners who want to vote for new leadership in the next election." The crowd murmured with excitement. Change was coming, and the board members were starting to realize they might not be in power much longer. Mrs. Davenport's face turned red. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "We are simply trying to uphold the integrity of the neighborhood." James leaned forward. "No, you're trying to control people with ridiculous rules, and it stops now." The crowd erupted in applause. The board had no choice but to back down, at least for the moment. But James knew they weren't done fighting yet. The real battle was just beginning. After the heated meeting, James knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily. True to his suspicions, another letter arrived in his mailbox just 2 days later. This time, the HOA claimed the treehouse was a safety hazard, and that if it wasn't removed within 7 days, they would have it torn down themselves. James clenched his jaw. This wasn't about safety. It was about power. The board was grasping at straws, trying to intimidate him. But he wasn't about to back down now. Instead of panicking, James took action. He called a professional contractor to inspect the treehouse and provide an official safety report. The contractor, a respected builder in town, confirmed that the structure was solid and met all safety standards. James smiled as he received the written report. This was exactly what he needed. Armed with evidence, he forwarded the report to the HOA along with a firm message. The treehouse is safe. Any attempt to remove it will be met with legal action for property damage and trespassing. He sent copies of the letter to all his neighbors, ensuring everyone knew just how far the HOA was willing to go. The community response was immediate. People were outraged that the board would threaten to destroy private property without justification. Even residents who had stayed quiet before began to speak out. If they can tear down a treehouse, what's stopping them from doing the same to our fences, playsets, or sheds? One neighbor posted in the group chat. James could feel the momentum shifting. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and now the entire neighborhood was watching their every move. If they thought they could scare him into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Days passed, and the HOA remained silent. James knew they were scrambling for their next move. He wasn't about to sit back and wait, though. He and his neighbors continued gathering signatures to call for a special election to remove the HOA board entirely. The community was fed up, and now they had a legal reason to take action. Meanwhile, James prepared for the worst. He installed security cameras facing the treehouse, ensuring that if the HOA tried anything sneaky, he'd have video proof. Then, late one night, his doorbell camera caught something shocking. A group of HOA board members, including Mrs. Davenport, crept into his yard with flashlights and a toolbox. James couldn't believe what he was seeing. They were actually planning to dismantle the treehouse themselves. He grabbed his phone and called the police immediately. Within minutes, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The officers arrived just in time to catch the HOA members in the act. Mrs. Davenport tried to talk her way out of it, claiming they were removing an illegal structure. But the officers weren't buying it. "Ma'am, this is private property. You have no legal right to be here," one officer said sternly. The HOA members were forced to leave, humiliated and furious. But James wasn't done yet. He sent the security footage to the entire neighborhood, exposing the board's underhanded tactics. The response was explosive. Residents flooded the HOA's email with complaints, demanding resignations. Even some of the board members who hadn't been involved distanced themselves, realizing their power was slipping away. James smirked. Now, it was only a matter of time before justice was served. The fallout from the break-in was immediate. The entire neighborhood was talking about how the HOA board had been caught trespassing on James's property, attempting to destroy the treehouse in the middle of the night. Local news even picked up the story after a neighbor shared the security footage online. Within days, the HOA was in full-blown crisis mode. Mrs. Davenport and her allies tried to downplay the incident, calling it a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. The residents were furious. If the board was willing to break the law just to enforce their ridiculous rules, what else had they done behind closed doors? With public pressure mounting, James and his neighbors submitted their petition to remove the board. They had gathered more than enough signatures to trigger a special election. The HOA had no choice but to comply. In the days leading up to the vote, Mrs. Davenport and her supporters desperately tried to regain control. They sent out letters warning homeowners that removing experienced leadership would cause chaos in the community. But their threats had lost all power. People had seen their true colors, and no one was falling for their scare tactics anymore. On election day, the results were overwhelming. Mrs. Davenport and the corrupt board members were voted out by a landslide. A new group of fair and reasonable homeowners, including James's neighbor Tom, was elected to replace them. One of their first actions? Revoking the absurd fines and restrictions that had been used to bully residents for years. As James watched the new board take charge, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA had tried to intimidate him, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. With the corrupt HOA board officially removed, the neighborhood finally felt like a community again. The new board wasted no time overturning unfair rules, refunding wrongful fines, and ensuring that future decisions were made with input from the homeowners, not just a handful of power-hungry individuals. James, though never interested in HOA politics before, was now seen as a hero among his neighbors. People stopped him on the street to thank him for standing up to the tyranny that had plagued their community for years. Despite the victory, Mrs. Davenport didn't go down quietly. A few days after the election, James received one final letter from her. This time, not from the HOA, but from her personal attorney. She was threatening to sue him for defamation, claiming that his security footage had damaged her reputation. James laughed as he read the letter. She had broken the law by trespassing on his property, and now she was playing the victim? He forwarded the letter to his lawyer, Mr. Carter, who assured him that the case was completely baseless. If she actually sues, she'll only embarrass herself further, Carter said. She's just trying to scare you. Ignore it. And so, James did exactly that. As the days passed, Mrs. Davenport disappeared from public view. Rumor had it that she sold her house and moved to another neighborhood, one where she could no longer control everyone around her. Meanwhile, James's treehouse remained standing, a symbol of his victory over an unjust system. Every afternoon, his kids played in it, laughing and making memories. What had started as a simple act of love for his children had turned into a battle for fairness, and in the end, justice had won. Life in the neighborhood had completely changed. Without the oppressive rules and constant harassment from the old HOA board, families felt free to enjoy their homes again. Kids played outside without fear of receiving complaints. Neighbors helped each other with home projects, and the community finally felt united. The new board operated fairly, ensuring that rules were reasonable and applied equally to everyone. The difference was night and day. James, though proud of what they had accomplished, was just happy that his kids could enjoy their treehouse in peace. One evening, as he watched Emily and Jake hoist a bucket up with their pulley system, Tom walked over with a grin. "You know, James, you could run for the HOA board next year," he joked. James laughed, shaking his head. "I think I've had enough HOA drama for one lifetime," he replied. But deep down, he knew that if the neighborhood ever needed him again, he wouldn't hesitate to fight back. After all, this wasn't just about a treehouse. It was about standing up for what was right. As the sun set behind the treehouse, James took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't had in months. He had fought against corruption, exposed injustice, and helped his community reclaim its freedom. And in the end, he had proven one simple truth. When people stand together against unfairness, no amount of intimidation can stop them. James's battle with the HOA wasn't just about a treehouse. It was about fairness, justice, and standing up to those who abuse their power. His determination not only saved his children's special hideaway, but also brought real change to his neighborhood, proving that even the most stubborn forces can be defeated when people unite for a common cause. Message to readers, viewers. No matter how small the issue may seem, always stand up for what's right. Whether it's an unfair rule, an abuse of power, or someone trying to intimidate you, remember that you're never alone. When people come together, they can create real change. Stay strong. Stay